This morning I introduced a thought to share with you today, and I told you this morning I'd end up not being able to cover all of the material. It's not a two-part lesson in the sense that you really needed to have the first half to understand the second half. They're very much independent thoughts within the two lessons, but just didn't have time this morning to cover all the things that I wanted to share with you. In John chapter 14 and in verse 3, when you couple that text with the one that Jim just read for us here out of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, you see basically two statements concerning Jesus. In John chapter 14 and verse 3, he tells them that I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. In this text here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 26, Paul basically describes for us that this memorial supper that we partake of is to show forth the Lord's death until He comes. And from those two basic thoughts out of John 14 and verse 3 and 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 26, I asked this basic question this morning. What do we do in the meantime? Jesus came, fulfilled all of the purposes that He desired. He died upon the cross as God had planned. He was resurrected from the dead, and He ascended back to the throne of God on high, exactly as God had planned for Him. And there's a fixed point in time that only the Father knows where Jesus will ultimately return, and the graves will open, and the resurrection will happen, and the stage will go off with the Son of God to be presented to His Father. But what do we do in the meantime? What do I do with the lifespan then that God gives me between those two historical moments? One that has already occurred and then one that will happen sometime into the future. What am I doing with the time that Jesus has blessed me with as I walk here upon God's earth? Now, this morning I spent too much time on a couple of things, so that kind of put me behind in the process. There is one part, if you're looking at your bulletin, you can see the outline there. There was a section I simply called, In the Meantime, We Need to Be Behaving Ourselves. I'm going to assume you know that, and I'm going to skip past that portion so that I can get to the rest of the study. Because I'm afraid if I got on to behaving ourselves, I'd talk about Roger the rest of the night. We'd never get anywhere. So let's move beyond that thought and let's talk about this. In the meantime, we need to remember who we are. That's a phrase sometimes my children probably get frustrated with me using for them. On many occasions when they leave the house, especially when they leave and go places where I am not going to be present, one of the last things that I generally say to them is, remember who you are. And that means a lot of different things. It means you're Brian Price's children, so you've got to behave in a certain way because of that. You're Deborah Price's children. You need to behave accordingly. You are God's children, and you need to behave accordingly. And that there's a reason why that you and I need to maybe continually remind ourselves of who we're really supposed to be in this life. And what I'm really supposed to be representing and what it is that I ought to be doing to proclaim and declare Jesus in front of those that I come in contact with. I want you to go back into 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10. Let's start there in our study together. In 2 Peter chapter 1 and in verse 10, where Peter writes for us in this moment, he says, that's right. 2 Peter 1 verse 10, Therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. For if you do these things, you will never stumble. Have you ever been preparing to leave for something and you have to take something with you and you ask over and over and over again? Last night that we left to go to a production up in Wheeling Park, and as we got to, I think it was right about Van Camp Street, Rachel said, do you have the tickets? And I hit the brakes, whipped the wheel, and head down Van Camp so that I could circle back. Generally speaking, though, we would like to be ready, right? And we double check. Do you have the ticket? Yes, I've got the ticket. Where'd you put the tickets? And we probably would have benefited if we had taken more care and I would not have had to whip it around and come back to the house to pick that up. Jesus, through the Apostle Peter here, wants us to appreciate, make your calling and election sure. We should never take our relationship with God and His Son for granted. We should never take that relationship for granted. It should be something that is so central to who we are. It should be something that is so focused to our very being that we always remember who it is that we are supposed to be. And that I strive daily to make sure that I'm in this relationship with Him and I'm being steadfast in that relationship. I don't want a day to go by where I forget who it is that I'm supposed to be. I don't want a day to go by that I forget that I am the child of God and need to live my life according to that thought and strive to make that calling and election sure on a daily basis. And then to stay steadfast to that decision that I've made. I want you to go back in your Old Testaments for a minute to a familiar passage. In the book of Joshua, in chapter 24, here's a familiar phrase that I want you to consider with me for a moment. In Joshua chapter 24, in verse 14, he says, Now therefore fear the Lord, serve Him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your father served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. Read it that way, by the way. Exclamation point, right? Sir, Joshua's not saying, now you fellas ought to consider whether you don't. No, he's vehement here. He's concerned about them. He knows the dangers that are going to lie ahead. He knows the risks that are involved. He knows the temptations that are going to occur for them to go back into the mindset of idolatry that had been prevalent among their people prior to this moment. The issues that they brought out of Egypt, we've talked before in lessons about the fact that the Israelites left Egypt, but they never really left Egypt. And so evident when you see them there at the mountain and Aaron has them fashion that golden calf. And the imagery of what they had been familiar with idolatry-wise in Egypt. And so Joshua's being very strong here. Fear the Lord. Serve Him with sincerity and truth. Get rid of all those other gods. The Lord Jehovah God needs to be your focus, and you need to be steadfast. And if it seems evil to you, verse 15, if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. And that's a challenge that He sets before all of us, by the way, by practice and principle. Choose you this day whom you will serve. Make a decision, Brian. Who are you going to be today? Are you going to be somebody who lives as a child of God? Are you going to be somebody who demonstrates the relationship that I chose to have with my Creator? Am I going to live by that standard and stay steadfast in it? Will I let the influences around me change my thinking about that? Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your father served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You know, sometimes that's it, and it's nice. We might have a painting or a picture or something that we've made and whatever they do. I can't even think of the word, cross-stitching or whatever it might be. And we put this on the wall, right? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But what does it mean? What does it mean to me personally? What does it mean to my household? Is it just a thought that sounds pleasant, a thought that seems fitting for a family to consider, or is it how we actually conduct ourselves? Joshua says to them in this moment, you can make all kinds of decisions. You can worship those gods of the Egyptians. You can worship the gods of the Amorites, the folks that used to dwell here. You've got all kinds of choices laid before you. And he says, but let me tell you about the choice I'm making. You choose for yourselves what you're going to do. You decide whether you want to be steadfast in your relationship with God or not. But I'm going to tell you, this is what me and my house are going to do. We're going to serve the Lord. It was going to be so tempting and so difficult for them as they moved forward to kind of forget who it was they were supposed to be. And so they were going to need to be steadfast in their decisions and choices. And so should we. And in order to stay steadfast and to remind ourselves of who we are, then maybe in that process we remember to offer ourselves in sacrifice to our Creator. Notice in Romans chapter 6 and verse 13. Do not, Paul's pretty plain here, right? Do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. You ever use the statement, make yourself presentable? And we generally make that statement based on the environment or the circumstance we're about to enter into, right? What is presentable may vary depending on the venue or the experience or the moment in which we're about to enter into. Well, as it pertains to the experience that we have as being followers of Jesus, he says we must be careful to present our bodies, to present this instrument that God has given us, this temple, to present it to Him for His good work. And not to present it before unrighteousness and sin. To make a determination to not forget who I am and to not forget that every day I should be being presentable before my Creator. That God is viewing me and my decisions and my choices and my life. He's examining how it is that I'm using this temple, this instrument that He has given to me, and He's determining whether I'm presentable to Him or not. And so don't forget who we are as we go through this life. And while we're waiting upon the return of Jesus and anticipating the wonderful blessings that come from that moment, don't forget who we're supposed to be in the meantime. And act and conduct and live our lives as those who are presentable before God. To offer ourselves in that fashion before Him. And to every day be watchful and careful of the things that can distract me from this commitment. And be honest about it. We tease Deborah a lot about a lot of things. I try not to bring very many of them up in the pulpit because I like to go home peaceably. But we tease her all the time because she can change subjects in a second. By the way, her mother's with her. I'll get in trouble for this. She's just as bad. They're very alike. Well, I'm just asking for it now, right? Picking on the wife and the mother-in-law in one breath. In our household, it's known as chasing the squirrel. And when the subject changes instantaneously, we say, there went the squirrel. Because, right, as soon as we're easily distracted people, right? That's the point I'm trying to make, not get myself in trouble. I'll dig out of this in a second. We're easily distracted people. There are a lot of squirrels in our lives, and that sounds strange too, but there are a lot of things, and they come up, and our attention goes, right? And our attention goes, and our attention goes. And what happens sometimes is we should be focused and centered and being watchful in our relationship with God. But here come all the things that distract us and persuade us and influence us and turn our attentions away. And we've got to be careful of those. He warned that church there at Ephesus in verse 4 of Revelation 2 that you've left your first love. You've been distracted. Oh, you've got tremendous qualities about the things that you're doing. And you're very fervent in your presentation of the truth of God's will. But in the process, you've forgotten why it is you're presenting God's will. In the process, you have forgotten the relationship that you have with your Creator that brought you to this circumstance to begin. You've lost your first love. It's possible for us to become distracted by this basic challenge. We become distracted by doing the right thing without remembering why it is we're doing the right thing. We become distracted by being focused upon doing what is right without giving any consideration whatsoever to why it is we're doing what's right. Why did I choose to follow the Creator to begin with? Why did I become a disciple of Jesus to begin with? Why is it that I've made these choices and decisions and then be watchful of the things that are pulling and distracting me away? And how often have we had some spiritual intent in mind, or we've had some spiritual purpose in mind and in our hearts and in our thoughts. And then we become distracted by something else and we soon put it aside. I was going to do this, or I was going to do that. I was going to refocus attention. I was going to spend more time in service to God. And we list all the things we were going to do. But the distractions come and we're not paying attention. And the next thing you know, all we're doing is chasing all the little issues of life, and we have no focus in the relationship with God. In 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 19, having faith and a good conscience, which some having rejected, concerning the faith have suffered shipwreck. We lose focus, we become shipwrecked. We turn aside from our faith and our commitments towards Jesus Christ, and our faith becomes shipwreck. While we wait for His return, don't forget who you are. Don't forget who it is we're supposed to be serving. Don't forget the character in which God would want us to present ourselves with on a daily basis. And stay steadfast in it. Well, let's move on. Let's look at this for a moment. While we wait for His return, be ready for everything. Well, thank you for the nice, concise statement, preacher, right? But what I mean by that is we don't always have a heads up on what might be around the next corner. Wouldn't it be great if we always just knew exactly what... Well, actually, the more I think about that, maybe it wouldn't be so great. You think you worry now? Imagine if you actually knew what was around the next corner, how much worry might be in our lives. And so we don't always know. We don't know where the next temptation might come from. We don't know what the next distraction might be. We don't know what the next challenge might be set us. So we need to be preparing ourselves by drawing closer to the Savior, by presenting ourselves daily as children of God, and preparing to handle the things that might come. Go to 1 Corinthians 10. Let's look. It's a familiar text, but let's look at it again and just consider it for a few moments of what Jesus, or rather the Apostle Paul, was sharing with us. And I don't want to just jump straight to verse 13, where we often do here in this text. Let's spend a moment in the narrative. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized unto Moses, and in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. That historical record of what happened to the Israelites is not just so that we have a documentation from it. He said the reason it's recorded is that we might learn something from it. It's one thing to say, well, I know about the Israelite history and I know about their bad behaviors and their evil choices that ultimately led them to have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. It's one thing to say, I understand the historical background of that account. It's yet another to say, what did I learn from it? That's what the writer Paul here is saying. What did we learn from that? And he says what we've learned is do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Let us commit sexual immorality or fornication, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Now stop and consider that for a minute. He reminds them of this history, not to just give them a history lesson, but to remind them that there was consequence. When they involved themselves in idolatry, there was consequence. When they involved themselves in sexual immorality, there was consequence. When they made choices and decisions to breach their relationship with God, to tempt Christ and the future they had in relationship to Him, to complain and to murmur at every turn, seemingly. He said, learn from their mistakes. These things happen to them as examples. They're written to admonish us. Stay away from these things. Stay out of these. These things bring harm. Be prepared. You and I are going to face similar kinds of temptations. We may not have a golden calf down here somewhere in Payton City that we're being asked to go bow down to, but my friends, there is idolatry all over the place. When there are things that are elevated above our Creator, an idol just isn't an image or something that's been fashioned by men's hands. An idol can become anything that we elevate above our Creator. Be ready. When the world tells you you don't need to prioritize God, He can come somewhere later in your priority list. Be ready for that moment, because that's what the world will tell us. Do you really have to be so committed? Do you really have to be that faithful? Do you really have to be that convicted? Right? Does God really have to come first all of the time? Be careful. The complaints and challenges that we often find ourselves in. Now verse 12. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Why would he say that? Again, we isolate verse 12 sometimes and we accept the warning that's given about take heed lest you fall. But he says it on the heels of the warnings out of the Israelite people. Verse 12 is not an isolated moment. It's a statement in connection to what he had just told them about the kinds of conduct that had been committed by that Israelite nation. So anybody that thinks that idolatry could never be a problem for them needs to take the warning. The person who thinks that sexual immorality can never be a problem for them needs to heed the warning. The person who thinks they would never complain about anything needs to heed the warning. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Be prepared for anything and everything that might tempt you. And then now the statement, verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. And I believe that was true for the Israelites, and it's true for folks after them, and it's true for us as well. They made their choices despite the fact that God had provided escape and ability for them to recognize their choices and decisions were not what they should make. I'd love to be able to tell you that you're going to live a temptation-free life. Wouldn't that be grand? To be able to go through life and not have ever one thing ever lure me or tempt me or draw me away from my relationship with God. But it's not a realistic thought. And so while I'm waiting on the Savior to return, I'm going to be making ready, and I'm going to be watchful, and I'm going to be paying attention. And I'm going to remember the examples of the Israelites and others who fell one after another because they did not make ready for the temptations that were going to come their way. And the world will do what it can and will want us to become what we're not supposed to be. And go back into John chapter 15 and in verse 19. Jesus really makes a very simple but yet profound acknowledgement. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. And Jesus tells us that the world won't necessarily love us in our state and condition of being a disciple and follower of His. The world prefers to love its own. That's what He said. The world prefers to love folks that think like it thinks. The world prefers to show preference and give deference to those who are already thinking like that. I was reading a political article, and I won't even tell you the politics that were involved. I just want you to understand the principle that was being discussed. But the article was talking about the politics from the standpoint of the idea that sometimes folks running for positions of power and influence, running for certain offices, need to remember that they can't only attract the people that already think like them. It's not enough. But that's the way the world is convinced. I'm just going to do everything I can to align myself with anybody and everybody that thinks like me. And I'll buy into the idea that anyone who is an enemy of the things I'm an enemy of, I'll join myself to them. Jesus says that's the mode of the world that it's trying to draw all of us into. And so be ready for that. The world's not going to want you to think like a Christian. The world's not going to want you to think like Christ would have you to think. The world is not going to want to embrace you and I when we live the purity of life that Jesus has prescribed. The world will want us to become more and more like it, and it will do anything and everything it can to get us to do that. And we all need to be watchful of that challenge. And then let me conclude tonight by this last point. And it might be the most important of all of them. While I'm waiting for the Savior to return, don't be afraid to ask for help while I wait. Have you ever tried to carry something that you knew you couldn't carry? And 25 people came by and said, "Let me help you with that." What'd you say? "I got it, I got it, I got it, I got it." Right? And you had it until it fell or you fell. We're not very good at asking for help. Well, I don't want to speak on your behalf. I know I'm not. I'm not. And that's not necessarily always a good thing. Especially when we're talking about the idea of maintaining our faith and convictions in relationship with Jesus. We're all going to need some help sometimes. We're all going to need somebody to encourage us, to uplift us, to walk with us. And sometimes I'm going to have to get past the fears and ask for help. And sometimes we also need to recognize that I may not always like the answers that I get. The advice and counsel that I need when I ask for help may not be what maybe I'd like to just feel better about a circumstance that you can't just erase and feel better about. Right? But ask. And be encouraged by others who maybe have experienced similar challenges or are able to help. And recognize that the help that comes from human form is always going to be flawed and challenged. I may not always be able to help you. That's a reality that in some ways I think that we all have to kind of come to terms with. There are some things that I am ill-equipped to help you with, but I might be able to find somebody who is equipped to help you. And might be able to encourage, or you might do the same. I may come and ask you for help, and you may just have to be honest and say, "Brian, I don't know how I can help you with that, but I know somebody who may be able to help you." And so just because one humanly frail individual is not prepared or able to assist you doesn't mean we should quit reaching out. Especially towards our God. Notice how He is described in 1 Chronicles 29:12. "Both riches and honor come from you, and you reign over all. In your hand is power and might, and your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all." Human wisdom and counsel can be of assistance, but at the end of the day, the greatest empowerment is to recognize that God and His hand is powerful and mighty. And He is able to give strength to everyone. And I don't always know how it is God functions and works in this world, to be quite honest with you. When I need help, probably the first place I should go is to God. And you just may be surprised at what God can do providentially to be able to put the right people or the right circumstances or the right help in your path. And the assistance that we're looking for or in need of might be more evident to us than we ever imagined when I trust in the power of my Creator. Notice how a same thought is expressed in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 7. Jesus teaching here, part of the Sermon on the Mount, makes very, very clear statement. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and ye will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. Let me ask you a quick question. Which of those three things is the easier to do? And I'm not asking for a show of hands. I just want you to think about it for a minute. Because all three of those things are in some ways vastly different, right? The first is request. Ask. The second takes more effort, right? Seek. And the third requires courage. Knock. And the door shall be open. Ask for help. Look for help. And be willing to knock on the door to ask for help. I ever tell you about the time that I've had two close encounters with lightning in my life. One of them was on Wheeling Island Stadium. I remember Dad used to work with Junior Bowen over there at Ormet, and Dad and Junior and I and Junior's son went up and watched the All-Star football game on a Saturday night up on Wheeling Island Stadium. And literally right in the middle of the game, and of course, no cell phones with weather bugs back in those days. It was just, the storm's here. But power blown out, light all goes out of the stadium. We take off, and Dad says, you guys stand right down here on this particular corner. I'm going to run and get the car, and I'll be right around to get you. Pouring down rain, thunder and lightning everywhere. Well, we went to the wrong corner. And we stood, and we stood, and we stood, and we stood, and he wasn't nowhere to be found. Junior told us, well, boys, go up on those. Surely those people won't mind if you take shelter up on their porch. But we were just a couple young kids, scared to death, go up on a stranger's porch. So surely this tree will be just fine for us to stand under. I didn't say we were bright. And we stood under that tree for quite a while. He finally come back by. Dad's still nowhere to be found, and he insisted, boys, get up on those people's porch. I don't care what they say to you or what happens. You've got to get up on that porch. And we no more than got on that porch till that tree was struck by lightning. I've had a healthy respect for lightning ever since that day. And I probably wasn't 6 or 7 years old, I imagine. Sometimes it's a fearful thing to ask for help, right? Sometimes there's anxieties and trepidations about it. I'm not sure. Do I have a right to knock? Should I knock? Should I ask? Should I seek? And especially as it relates to the Savior and to our Creator, the answer is always yes. And you don't know necessarily what door God may be putting in front of me and telling you, Brian, your help is on the other side of that door. Knock on it. Our souls are too valuable and it's too important to not get past all the anxiety. Our spiritual well-being is too important. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And to him who knocks it will be open. That's the encouragement that Jesus is striving to give us when we're challenged while we're waiting for His return. And the difficulties of this life begin to overwhelm us. And so do it with confidence. Let me note with you 1 John chapter 5, verse 14. 1 John chapter 5, verse 14. Now this is the confidence that we have in Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we have asked of Him. The relationship we have with God, especially when it comes to asking for His help and His strength and His guidance, needs to be understood from a confidence level. We know these things. Notice that. We have this confidence in Him. If we ask Him anything and it fits within His will and His purposes, then God will answer. He will strengthen. He will guide. He will lead. Our petitions will be responded to. There's no guarantee, by the way, in the text of how the response will be or what the response will be or the manner in which God does any of those things. But it's the confidence in the relationship that we build with Him that leads us to ask, to seek, and to find, to confidently present our challenges before the Creator. And so while we wait for the Savior to return, don't be afraid to ask for help. And in some ways tonight that would include our help. I don't know that I'll be equipped to answer the challenges you might be facing. I don't know that we can remedy any situation at any point in time without further thought and consideration. But I know this, that help is available. First and foremost from a powerful and mighty God. From a God who understands us better than we know ourselves. And I have every confidence that God is able to then do whatever's necessary to put me in the right circumstances or put others in the right circumstances or do whatever's needed. If I'm willing to seek and to knock and find the answers. I encourage you tonight, brethren, don't forget who we are. No matter what the world does, and no matter what choices it makes, and no matter what persuasion it brings, and no matter what's coming around the next corner, let's not forget who we are. And let's serve the Lord faithfully. And let's present our lives before Him as faithful servants. And when we fail and when we slip and when we need His aid and assistance, we petition Him and we confidently approach Him and He responds to help us every step of the way. And if you're ready to step out into His promises of never known the cleansing power of His blood through baptism, well, maybe you've done that. But tonight need the prayers of the saints here. And if that would help and aid you even in this moment, to seek forgiveness of trespasses or to strengthen our relationship with God, He is ready and able to do all that we ask according to His will. And so if we can help in some way, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?